Okay, well, let's get started. It's 6:01 and we should be good to start on time and end on time. My name is David Gitlin, and I'll be your facilitator for tonight's virtual public briefing. And you are joining us to learn about the draft supplemental environmental impact statement for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. So welcome. Before we get going, I'd like to introduce my colleagues that are on the call today. So let's begin with Greg.
So I'm Greg Johnson. I'm the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program Administrator.
Good evening. My name's Chris Regan. I'm the Environmental Manager for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program.
Hi, good evening. I'm Angela Finley with the Environmental Team for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program.
Hello, good evening. I am Haley Reff, and I am the Cultural Resources Program Manager for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Team.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And Greg.
So once again, welcome and good evening, everyone. This briefing is meant to give you some background on this major mega project that we are undertaking. And this project has a history that goes back almost a quarter of a century. This region has been looking to replace this bridge and modernize this 5-mile corridor. So you're going to hear about why we need to replace this bridge and why the corridor itself needs to be modernized. So once again, we're looking at two bridges that carry I-5 over the Columbia River. One of those bridges is 107 years old. The other is 66 years old. So both of these bridges have served this region well, but they are well beyond their useful modern life. So this span carries over $132 million worth of goods every day, 365 days a year. So this is an economic lifeline, not only for the local area and the region, but for the West Coast. So I-5 is the only interstate that connects Mexico to Canada, and it services all of the tremendously important ports that lie along the West Coast. So this is a tremendously important project for not only the cities of Portland and Vancouver and the states of Washington and Oregon, but for the nation. So you're going to hear a lot of information. We ask you to please ask as many questions in the chat or in the question and answer function. And we will seek to answer those about the process. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to David to talk to you about how we're going to proceed tonight. Oh no, I have one more slide, take that back. So once again, the objectives for this public briefing is to provide you information about the draft supplemental environmental impact statement process. This can be found in the document when it's published this fall and how the 60-day public comment period works. We're going to introduce the Section 106 process, why it is important to the historic properties in the program area, and how to comment on its findings. And finally, we're going to answer any process questions that you may have regarding these tremendously important issues. So now I'm going to turn it back over to David to walk us through what you can expect the rest of the night.
Thanks, Greg. A couple of notes on captions and accessibility. So if you are joining us via YouTube, you're able to use closed caption function, and you can enter the link that you see on your screen to get there. And we also have captioning available on Zoom, and there should be a closed caption button for you to click. This is a sample of a Zoom toolbar. Everyone looks a little bit different. And then, as Greg mentioned, we will be answering questions at the end of our presentation tonight. So there's a Q&A function that you can enter your questions about the supplemental environmental impact statement process. And we will answer those questions towards the end of this briefing tonight. And if by chance your question is not answered tonight, do feel free to follow up directly, and we can do the best to answer your question as best we can. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Again, Chris Regan with our environmental team, and Angela and I will talk a little bit about the environmental document that is coming your way soon. I'll go into the background and the history, and then Angela will pick up with what we're doing specifically for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. It's important that we start conversations about the National Environmental Policy Act by looking at the law specifically. The National Environmental Policy Act was passed in 1970, and it was one of the first laws that required federal government decision makers to consider the environmental impacts of their actions, as well as public comment before making a decision. The law requires that federal agencies assess and disclose those environmental effects of those proposed actions, and it ensures that agencies consider the public comments as part of their decision-making process. The environmental impact statement process is designed to ensure consideration is made of those environmental effects and that there's place for public comment as we drive through this process. Those comments include impacts to the environment, specifically air quality, water quality, ecosystems, climate, etc. Historic and cultural impacts, including consideration of tribal consultation, and specific community impacts, including residential and commercial displacement and considerations of environmental justice. Next slide, please. But the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program didn't start this process. We actually picked it up from a previous project that occurred in the same location called the Columbia River Crossing. That project began in 2004. It began as an environmental impact statement that was drafted in 2008. That the environmental impact statement for the Columbia River Crossing evaluated a no-build alternative and 4 build alternatives. So it went through the initial process of developing and analyzing environmental impacts with a new project. In 2011, the Columbia River Crossing made it through a draft and a final environmental impact statement and arrived at a federal record of decision, which identified a selected alternative. That selected alternative was a document that said what Federal Highways and Federal Transit Administration agreed to be the path forward. And that was changed twice due to reevaluations following the record of decision. Those reevaluations occurred in 2012 and 2013. And again, it documented the Columbia River Crossing Locally Preferred Alternative, or the CRC LPA. Unfortunately, in 2014, that project was suspended due to the lack of regional consensus, and it sat suspended since 2014. Although it was still on the books for Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administrations, who remain the federal co-lead as the NEPA agencies for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. Next slide, please. In 2019, both states, Oregon and Washington, determined that this project was too important to leave on the shelf. And so a bi-state memorandum of intent that was signed by Governors Brown and Inslee restarted the program to replace the bridge. That was the time that the Columbia River Crossing transitioned into the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. For IBR, a bi-state legislative committee was established for both Oregon and Washington, staffed by both Oregon and Washington, to provide oversight and guidance as we shaped the program's work. The Oregon Department of Transportation and Washington State Department of Transportation continue to partner with federal, state, and local agencies and local tribes as we advanced the discussion of what the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program would be. Our local partner agencies included a number of transportation agencies, including the transit agencies, the local planning agencies, Oregon Metro and Southwest Washington Regional Transportation Council. It includes both cities of Portland and Vancouver, and the Port of Portland and the Port of Vancouver. Next slide, please. And this is where I hand it off to Angela.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And good evening again. I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the draft supplemental environmental impact statement, or sometimes we shorten that to be called the draft SEIS. As Chris mentioned, the original compliance documents for the National Environmental Policy Act were prepared for the Columbia River Crossing Project, a draft EIS and a final EIS, followed up by a record of decision. And even though that project was suspended in 2014, the transportation challenges that were intended to be addressed by the CRC project were not addressed and continue to this day. And so what we call that is our needs for the program. Those are the problems that we're trying to solve and the purpose of solving those needs. And so the purpose and need for the CRC project is the same as it is for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. It remains the same. Similarly, the range of alternatives that were evaluated in the Columbia River Crossing draft EIS still remain valid as solutions to addressing those issues, to addressing those technical and economic needs for the program. As Chris mentioned, there were 4 what he called build alternatives. Those are 4 different solutions that were evaluated in the CRC environmental impact statement. In the final EIS for CRC, they narrowed that down to a single alternative, and that was what the record of decision was based on. Since that CRC locally preferred alternative was identified, during the time that transpired between when the program was suspended to today, there have been changes in the conditions, including the physical environment, different priorities in the community, and different regulations that have come into effect since that time. So when the Interstate Bridge Program restarted this process, our federal lead agencies conducted another reevaluation in compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, what we call NEPA, to assess how many, and the extent of these changes in conditions. And based on that reevaluation of the past work, it was determined that a supplemental environmental impact statement should be prepared so that we could disclose any new adverse impacts, any new or changed mitigation that had occurred since 2013. Next slide, please. So you're going to hear us talk a lot about the IBR modified LPA. As I mentioned, in the draft, in the work for the CRC project, it ended with a record of decision. That was a decision to advance a locally preferred alternative as its solution to move into later design and construction. And so when the IBR process was restarted, we are using the CRC LPA as the starting point. We have updated that LPA. We have modified it based on different changes that have occurred since 2013. And that is in essence what the modified LPA is, modified locally preferred alternative for the IBR program. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in just a moment about some of the components of that. But as you see on the screen, we have an image of it. This is only part of the corridor with the main river crossing in the middle of the diagram. You can see Hayden Island on the lower half and downtown Vancouver on the upper corner there. When we move into preparing a supplemental environmental impact statement, we are going to be preparing both a draft document, which we are going to be publishing soon, early this fall. And ultimately, we'll be publishing a final SEIS as well as an amended record of decision. But where we are right now is developing the draft supplemental EIS. And I know there's a lot of words on the page, but this is just kind of a snapshot of its table of contents, if you will. So you can get a sense of what this document is. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these individual chapters in the document. There will be a summary document that we prepare. There will be some introductory material that we call the front matter, where you will see kind of an abstract of what the program is, signatures by all of our lead agencies. Then we'll move into chapters 1, which really establishes why we are doing the project, what we're trying to solve. Chapter 2 is a description of the alternatives that we are evaluating. And then the large chapter, chapter 3, is usually where it gets very interesting in terms of for each environmental, community, transportation discipline, what are today's existing conditions and what will be the consequences to the environment if the project is moved forward with the modified LPA, as well as considering a baseline, what we call a no-build alternative. We also have a chapter 4, which is compliance with another federal regulation, Section 4F of the U.S. Department of Transportation Act. That is a specialized chapter that for the IBR program is really focusing a lot on historic properties and parks and other recreational facilities. And then as you can see, there is a host of appendices of supporting documents to this overall supplemental environmental impact statement. So as I mentioned, chapter 1 is one of what we call our foundational chapters. It's establishing what are the problems that are needing to be solved. Those are our needs. And for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program, we have 6 problem statements, 6 needs that need to be addressed. Safety of the highway and active transportation facilities. There is impaired freight movement today in the corridor that we're trying to improve. There is congestion on the highway that we're looking to improve. The structures itself, both the interstate bridge as well as the bridge over the North Portland Harbor, are both vulnerable to earthquakes. So we're going to be looking at seismic improvements to those structures. If you've had the opportunity to walk across the interstate bridge or ride your bike, or it is tight going. And so we're looking at improving bike and pedestrian paths to increase the use and conditions of those facilities. And then our 6th item listed here is our public transportation. We're looking at improving, extending public transportation across the river to support expanded public transit service, as well as ways to reduce congestion on the highway. Chapter 2 of the Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement is a description of the alternatives. So chapter 1 was establishing what needs to be fixed. Chapter 2 is what are different types of solutions that we can look at to address those challenges, those needs for the project. So I'm going to run through and explain some of the terms that we use, and then we'll jump into looking a little bit more closely at the modified LPA. We are in the supplemental EIS. We are looking at two alternatives. One is the no-build alternative, which that's the scenario with what happens in the future if no improvements are made to the interstate bridge and the 5-mile corridor that we're looking at, which stretches from Victory Boulevard in Oregon up to SR 500 in Washington. And so we look at, this is really kind of what we call a baseline, is what happens if nothing is done? What happens to congestion? What happens to safety, seismic conditions, and so forth? And we contrast that and compare it to what happens if we make improvements that are included in the modified locally preferred alternative. And this is a set of multimodal improvements that address the purpose and need for the program. We'll talk a little bit today about within the modified LPA, there are some locations where we have a couple design options to consider. And so we will look at, that'll be part of the environmental analysis that you'll also see in the supplemental EIS when it is published. So why is it important that we look at different alternatives and design options? They provide a range of solutions so that we can compare and consider, analyze different trade-offs. One option may be better for property impacts, but maybe worse for impacts to the natural environment. And so it's important that we look at those different trade-offs so that we can make an informed decision when we get to the final supplemental EIS and the record of decision. Design options also give decision makers a variety of paths to consider in fulfilling the purpose and need. There's not always just one solution, but we're trying to look at the best solution. We ensure that the program remains compliant with federal regulations, and we also look at ways to maximize benefits while also minimizing harm to the environment and the community. Here's just a snapshot of the program corridor. As I mentioned, our southern terminus in Oregon is down at the North Victory Boulevard interchange. It is a 5-mile corridor roughly from Victory Boulevard up to SR 500 at the top of the graphic in Washington. There are 7 interchanges on I-5 within this stretch. We are proposing improvements at each of the interchanges. Both the I-5 bridges over the North Portland Harbor and over the main channel of the Columbia River are proposed to be replaced. There is extension of public transit, both in terms of light rail service as well as express bus on shoulder. And I know it's hard to see on this graphic, but there is some light green or teal improvements that represent a lot of active transportation improvements to make the corridor more contiguous for those that decide to bike, walk, or roll through this area. If we go to the next slide, we have some of the same information. It's just in text format, but again, we're replacing bridges over the Columbia River in North Portland Harbor. We are looking at 3 different bridge configurations for the Columbia River Bridge: a single level fixed span, I should say a pair of single level fixed span bridges, a pair of double deck fixed span bridges, and a pair of single level movable span bridges. Improved active transportation facilities, extension of light rail transit nearly 2 miles from the Yellow Line's current terminus at the Expo Center up to Evergreen Boulevard in Vancouver. 3 new light rail transit stations, one at Hayden Island, one at the Vancouver waterfront, and one near Evergreen Boulevard. There are also several options for park and ride locations in downtown Vancouver that are being studied. Shoulders on the highway, particularly over the bridge, will be widened for safety reasons and also to accommodate express bus on shoulder transit service, as well as to provide a pathway for emergency response vehicles. There are 7 interchanges that will be modified, some with minor improvements and others with more wholesale improvements. And then in terms of the freeway itself, the highway, the I-5 highway, we are looking to retain 3 through lanes in each direction, northbound and southbound, with the addition of 1 auxiliary lane in each direction, and also looking at a design option that considers adding 2 auxiliary lanes across the Columbia River bridges. Next slide, please. So what is exactly evaluated in the draft SEIS? We are evaluating the 2 alternatives, a no-build alternative and the modified LPA. If we go to the next slide, what are we looking at in terms of how we are evaluating those 2 alternatives and the various design options? We first look at what's out there today, what currently exists in the program area, and we call that our existing conditions. And then we look at what happens if the modified LPA is constructed and is fully operational in the future. What would be the impacts to the natural and what we call the built or the community environment in and around the program area? That's what we call our environmental consequences, our impacts and benefits. Why do we look at these different types of conditions and consequences? Because it helps us really understand what is here today and what could be here in the future. And it provides a way to compare the no-build alternative with the modified LPA by looking at those benefits and impacts, trade-offs of doing nothing or making improvements. Next slide. So it's not quite that simple when you get down into the nuts and bolts about it, because we look at impacts from a different set of perspectives. We look at long-term benefits and effects. That's like after the new improvements are constructed, what is it like for pedestrians and bicyclists? What is it like for the environment, for the view, for land use and so forth? That is after improvements are constructed. What are those long-term changes? Could be beneficial or it could be impactful. We also look at short-term impacts during construction. And it's interesting because many of the impacts occur during construction and are more temporary. We also look at what's called indirect effects. This is a requirement of the National Environmental Policy Act, where we have to look either farther in distance, not either, actually we have to look both at impacts that occur farther in distance or further in time. So for example, some of the work that we will be doing to construct the bridges could, with the flow of water, if there's sedimentation in the water, that sedimentation can flow downriver and have impacts further in distance. Or over time, sometimes impacts don't result at first, but can be noticeable later, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. And so part of the environmental analysis is identifying those indirect effects that could occur. And then the last type of impact that we look at is what is called cumulative effects. This is when we look at the impacts of the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program in combination with other improvements that are going on around the area. For example, other development projects that are happening in downtown Vancouver or on Hayden Island or near Victory Boulevard. It looks at past impacts that have happened over time when maybe past development occurred. And we also look at what we call foreseeable future impacts, actions that could occur in the future. And so we're really looking at the Interstate Bridge Program in combination, not just as it's on its own, but also in combination so that we can really address what is the cumulative effects on air quality, on land use, on hazardous material sites, and so forth. That's kind of the impact and benefit analysis. In cases where we have impacts to the community or the environment, we go through a prioritization of first we look at trying to avoid those impacts if at all possible. If we're not able to avoid them, we look at design and other methods to try and minimize impacts. And in some cases, we will be also mitigating for adverse impacts. And sometimes those are required by best management practices or regulatory compliance with permits and approvals that the program will need to get. And others are going to be very specific for the type of impact that we have within the study area. So we are looking at close to, I'd say about 25 different environmental disciplines that we're doing this type of evaluation. And we've grouped those into kind of 3 categories. We are looking at transportation related impacts and benefits, community benefits, and those to the natural environment. And I'll kind of take each of these categories one at a time. And when the draft supplemental EIS is published, you will see a very large chapter with a section for each one of these bulleted environmental technical areas, in which we'll walk through the environmental analysis of the modified LPA and the no-build alternative. So let's start with transportation. So as you can see, it's not just about transportation in terms of cars on the highway, but it's also about freight use of the highway and the local road system. It's about navigation of the Columbia River. We are looking at local streets. We are looking at transit, public transit service. We're looking at active transportation. That's our pedestrian and bicycle movements and safety. Much of our transportation analysis of what happens on the road or with public transit leads into our analysis of air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, and noise and vibration. And so that is a component, a big component of our impacts analysis and benefits analysis that you will have the opportunity to explore the details of our analysis and the findings of that analysis in the draft SEIS. Our next category is those impacts that are related to the community. And so some of these include cultural resources, economics, electric and magnetic fields, environmental justice, equity, hazardous materials, land use, impacts to neighborhoods, parks and recreational facilities, types of property that may need to be acquired for the program, public services and utilities. So these are considered in terms of how the modified LPA fits into the built environment. And again, those impacts could be direct, they could be short-term related to construction, or they could be farther in distance or further in time. So it may not just affect exactly where the construction activities are taking place, but if you live 3 blocks away, you will still probably have some noise and air quality impacts. And so the environmental impact statement will be disclosing all of the analysis for each of those types of conditions. Our third category is the natural environment. And so this is where you will see some of our analysis for climate change, ecosystems, geological conditions and groundwater, how it affects the visual quality, water quality and hydrology, and wetlands. And so this is how the modified LPA interacts with the natural landscape. This analysis is guided through very scientific-based methods where we have conducted samples, conducted a fair amount of field work in order to really understand what is out there, what are our existing conditions, and looking at how the program could affect those. It evaluates impacts to habitat, wildlife, and natural resources, the water, the air, and the vegetation. I think that brings us to the end of kind of an overview of the types of analyses, the subject matter, the different environmental disciplines that will all be disclosed in the draft supplemental EIS. And so I'll pass the torch over to Greg to talk a little bit about our public comment process.
Thank you, Angela. And once again, good evening, everyone. So you've heard the what's in the document. Now we're going to talk about how you can participate to make this document as good as possible. We're talking about a bridge that's gonna last for 100+ years. So we want to make sure that everything we do is smart and has as much public comment as possible. So early in this fall, we are going to release the draft supplemental environmental impact statement. This will be the document that you just heard about, and we want you to comment to help make this document as good as possible. So the ways you can do that are to submit a web-based form. You can email comments to us. You can send comments through regular mail. You can call our IBR office to leave a verbal comment. Or you can come to one of 2 public hearings that we're going to have, or you can come to both public hearings and make your comments that we will capture and respond to. So once again, we're going to provide various ways to provide these comments as the publication date approaches. And there will be information on our website that we will give you that information at the end of the presentation. But once again, this document will be made easily available and accessible by all community members. It will follow ADA standards, Americans with Disability Act standards, but we will also offer online search functions. If you're only looking for a specific portion of this document, we will have a search function where you can easily find it. We also know that not everyone has English as their primary language. So we will be interpreting this document into multiple languages and provide services for folks who are who have English as a second language. So we are going all out to make sure that you have ways to comment and make this document as good as it can be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Chris Regan.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, and as a technical practitioner, we want to make sure that we give you some ideas of what we're looking for, things that are going to help us use your comment to make our environmental document better. We want to hear from you. And those constructive comments really are the ones that provide feedback that will help us either refine our design options, update technical analysis, but all of those will be used to inform our final supplemental EIS. Specific comments should pertain to the information that you learned or read within the draft supplemental EIS. And the comment should also include a request, or it could also include a request for more information. So if you didn't see it, you think it should be there, you can ask for more information. If you are going to share your opinion on design options or specific analysis, it's really helpful if you provide the information from what you learned within the draft supplemental, the thing that helped you form that opinion. So if you tie it to those specific, it's a lot easier for us to respond in kind and carry that forward for you. The other thing that's really important is that comments should not include any attachments or hyperlinks to outside information. But if you do have sources, please cite those sources within your comment, because again, we will carry those forward and make sure that we reference that in our response. Next slide.
So we're going to talk about the next steps. And once again, the responses to the comments received during the public comment period will be published in the final supplemental environmental impact statement. And we're anticipating with a document of this size and a project of this complexity that we're going to receive probably close to 10,000 comments. But those public comments will be used to update the technical analysis, refine design options, and inform future design. So the design of the proposed improvements, including the selection of specific design options and mitigations, will be further refined based on the findings and public input, which will be documented in the final supplemental environmental impact statement and ultimately the amended record of decision. So a final supplemental environmental impact statement and amended record of decision are anticipated in 2025. And we're planning on starting construction in late 2025. So this process is moving. After years of studying, folks are very much anticipating us breaking ground, and we're hoping that will happen in late 2025. Next slide, please. So now Haley Reff to talk about Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Haley.
Thank you very much, Greg, and good evening, everyone. I'm excited to share a few details with you about our Section 106 process and upcoming public comment opportunity. Slide, please. So Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 is a process that all federal agencies must follow to consider effects on historic properties from projects like IBR. This is a separate law from NEPA that IBR must comply with, and similar to NEPA, Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration are also co-leading this process. Section 106 establishes a process for evaluating effects that are within what is called the Area of Potential Effect, or APE. And this fall, documents to identify historic properties called Determinations of Eligibility and assess effects called Findings of Effects will be published for public comment. Section 106 relates specifically to historic properties and cultural resources, which includes any pre-contact or historic district, site, building, structure, or object, such as artifacts, records, and remains. The Section 106 comment period will run separately, yet parallel to the draft SEIS public comment period. The Section 106 public comment period lasts 30 days and will begin this fall, 2024. Slide, please. So Section 106 is a procedural law and is comprised of 4 key steps. In step 1, the lead agencies initiate the process. This includes determining the undertaking, coordinating with other reviews, identifying the relevant consulting parties, and planning to involve the public. Step 2 is the identification of historic properties. This includes determining the area of potential effect, or APE, preliminary survey work to identify historic properties, determinations of eligibility, all in consultation with the Section 106 consulting parties and the public. In step 3, we then assess the potential effects of the program to the historic properties that were identified in step 2, again, in consultation with consulting parties and the public. And this is where we currently are in our Section 106 process. It's step 3 involving the public. Then finally, coming up in step 4, we resolve the adverse effects that are identified in the previous step by developing and considering alternatives or modifications to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effects. For the IBR program, these resolutions will be documented in a programmatic agreement, or PA. Slide, please. As described in step 2 of the Section 106 process, the area of potential effect, or APE, was determined in 2023 and is located in portions of both Washington and Oregon, reflecting program components and design options under consideration. It is within this area of potential effect that historic properties have been identified and program effects have been analyzed as laid out in steps 2 and 3 of the Section 106 process. Slide, please. The identification of historic properties in step 2 of the process has been conducted and will be presented in the Section 106 Determinations of Eligibility, or DOEs, for public comment. There is one DOE document for each above-ground historic resource identified that was considered potentially eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, and why. The assessment of effects laid out in step 3 of the process has been conducted and will be presented in the Section 106 Findings of Effect, or FOEs, for public comment. There is one document for each historic property that was determined eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. Possible effect findings in these documents are an adverse effect, which is determined when a program activity may alter the characteristics of an historic property that make it significant. A no adverse effect, which is determined when a program activity will have an effect on an historic property, but will not alter the characteristics that make it significant. And no effect, which is determined when program activities will have no effect to an historic property. For both the identification process and the effects analysis process, consultation with Section 106 consulting parties occurred prior to finalizing determinations. Furthermore, all documents have been concurred with by the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office or the Washington Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, respective to the state in which the property is located. Slide, please. So some next steps. This fall, there will be a cultural resources online open house to share details of the determinations of eligibility and findings of effect with the public and to gather your input. Then we will consider mitigation strategies for known adverse effects. Next, as part of step 4, we will generate a draft of a project level programmatic agreement to include roles and responsibilities of the agency and the consulting parties, agreed upon measures to resolve adverse effects, processes for the phased identification and evaluation of historic properties, and protocols for involving stakeholders in consultation as effects are identified and resolved. Finally, we will consult with the public regarding the draft of the programmatic agreement, which will include measures for mitigation of known adverse effects to Section 106 properties. We are anticipating conducting that outreach in early 2025. Slide, please. So similarly on how to participate, the Section 106 comment period will commence approximately 30 days after the beginning of the draft SEIS public comment period. Participation is very similar and can occur via the online open house. Comments can be shared with us via web-based form, email, or written through mail. And additional notifications will be sent out to notify the public when the Section 106 comment period begins. To close the Section 106 portion of this presentation, next slide, please. I would like to share a few resource links with you in case you are interested in learning more about the Section 106 process overall, or reviewing the materials that we have shared for the cultural resource process thus far with the public at that top link on our website. Thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you. We really appreciate your involvement. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Haley. So now we are going to transition to our question and answer period of this meeting. And there have been a handful of questions submitted so far, and we will begin to go through them generally in the order that they're received. So if you have a question based on what you've heard, please do enter it into the Q&A box. And here's a reminder, if you've joined us on Zoom, you can click the Q&A box and enter your question. One note is that, as you've heard, the document isn't final, so we're unable to speak to specific findings, but generally you can talk about process of the program and the process of developing these documents. And if we are run out of time, please do follow up with us, and I'll share the website link at the end of this Q&A section. So with that, I'll begin with the first question that came in, which is an easy one. Will slides be made available after this presentation? The answer to that is yes. Give us a couple days to a week to get those online, but we'll PDF this slideshow, and that will be available for you. Excuse me. Next question. There was a request to clarify the two options of the I-5 westward shift between Mill Plain and SR14 notations. So it's probably helpful if I bounce back to that slide to speak to that. And Chris, I think you're going to talk to that.
Yeah, I am. I'm trying to catch up with where this is written. So as Angela was saying earlier during the presentation, in an environmental impact statement, sometimes you develop options that compare differing impacts. And in this case, there are impacts to the east with the historic fort, and those are kind of the historic and resources. And then to the west, there would be some community impacts. And so the options that we are looking at with this westward shift is to say, what are the trade-offs as you look at the options? If you first center the I-5 alignment where it is, or if it's shifted west, specifically between SR14 and Mill Plain Boulevard. If there are specific aspects that people want to hear about that, we can go into more detail. But again, this is really looking at if you center it, there may be more impacts to the east. If it's shifted to the west, you avoid those impacts on the east side.
Thank you, Chris. Next question. Excuse me. Given the planned construction start in late 2025, when will you begin the property acquisition process? And a second part of that question, how do you know you will have sufficient funding to acquire the required properties and move ahead? So I think, Angela, you can speak to the first part of that question with as many details as you have at this point in time. And Greg, maybe you can speak to the funding portion of this question.
Yeah, sure. I will speak to the plan construction and right away. So as we mentioned when we were describing the National Environmental Policy Act, we prepare a draft supplemental EIS, have the public comment, and then prepare a final supplemental EIS followed by a decision document, the amended record of decision. Property acquisition typically does not begin until the record of decision is issued. And so it's an excellent question to say, you know, if the record of decision is happening in 2025, and as Greg indicated, we are looking at moving forward and getting construction started also at the end of 2025. You might ask, how can that happen? How can you acquire right away so quickly? The modified LPA has a expansive number of improvements in it, and so the program will be broken into smaller construction packages. We are still in the process of identifying how many packages and what is in each package, but there are some isolated areas that we can get started that are on public right-of-way where private property acquisition is not required. And so it is those areas that we can get under construction right after the record of decision is issued for the NEPA process. Greg, if you want to add anything to that, or if you can address the funding part of that question, I'll pass it over to you.
No, Angela, that's spot on. Those early contracts will not require right-of-way purchases, so we will be able to begin certain aspects of the work without all of the right-of-way being purchased. But as far as will we have enough dollars to purchase right-of-way, currently we have over $5 billion committed for the program from both state sources and federal sources. We also have tolling authorization as a source of funding for the program. We will be doing a new estimate as soon as we get through the draft supplemental process to update what the estimate will be. But one of the commitments of the program is to live within the budget and the identified funding we have. So that is the commitment both DOTs have made and the program has made to the public to build within our budget. So we will be looking at making sure that we are building the most efficient and the most effective cross-section to save dollars as we move forward. But this is going to be a long haul of a program, and right now we do have dollars identified. There's still more federal funding that we will be looking forward to obtaining.
Great, thank you, Greg. Kind of a similar question, and maybe Angela and Greg can tag team this one. But with construction planned to start in 2025, which packages are anticipated to start? And is there a construction procurement schedule that can be shared with the industry at this time?
So I'll jump in, and Angela, you can add. So we had a meeting back this spring with the industry where we had over 300 contractors and consultants come and get an update of how we plan on attacking the procurement of more than 28 different contracts to build this program. We have a document on our website that speaks to this. And I would ask that folks go to our website and look for that document. It should be relatively easy to find. We are looking at making sure that we have packages broken to digestible sizes. So contractors, both local and national, can see themselves in it. Small businesses, women and minority-owned businesses will be playing a significant role in helping to deliver this. So this is something that we have committed to make sure that this program is procured in a rational and digestible way. So hopefully that answered the question, David.
Angela, anything to add on to that?
No, Greg nailed it, so thank you.
Great, thanks, Greg. Next question is a question for Angela and Chris about some elements of the draft SEIS. So the specific question is, will the draft SEIS have 3D graphics or animations that show impacts on Vancouver and Hayden Island?
Sure, thanks. I can take a stab at that. The draft supplemental EIS is primarily in two-dimensional graphics that can be viewed online, either electronically online, or we will have a few printed copies of the document. There are no animations, but would encourage you, when the document is published, to definitely take a look at some of our visualizations that are included in the document for with and without the program. In particular, there's a handful of those that look at the different bridge configurations over the Columbia River to show how those configurations look different across the landscape.
Okay, thanks, Angela. Next question, another question about what's in the draft SEIS. Will the draft SEIS have a data-driven safety analysis?
I'm not sure what is meant by data-driven safety analysis in quotes, if that's a particular, a specific methodology. We do have a safety analysis. It is quantitative in nature, and that will be in Chapter 3 in our transportation subsection.
Thank you, Angela. And there was a question from somebody with trucking, and I'll just say, I'll share website detail at the end of this meeting, and I would encourage you to reach out via the website on the Contact Us page. Next question is again about the westward shift and a request for a little bit more detail. So Chris, Angela, wondering if I go back to maybe the image.
Yeah, let's go to the image. And maybe I can kind of point out, it's really hard to see the westward shift as we're only talking about shifting I-5 approximately 40 feet, I believe, the center line of I-5 about 40 feet to the west. And that occurs, if you look in the Vancouver area on the right-hand side of I-5, there's a label that says I-5 alignment. 2 options in yellow font. And so it's just right down there between the SR14 interchange and the community connector Evergreen Station area. So it's just it's a short distance maybe half a mile or so of the freeway. Don't quote me on that. That is what the program team kind of calls a pinch point. You have historic properties on the east side of the freeway, and you have development right up to the freeway on the west side. And so that's a good example of where we're looking at just a slight design change, a slight shift to see what the trade-offs are of keeping the I-5 centered on the main, or the I-5 main line centered on its current alignment, or if we're shifting that slightly to the west. There will be impacts either way, because as I mentioned, development goes right up to I-5 on both sides of it today. So I hope that's a little bit more understandable. When we have in the draft supplemental EIS, when we walk through a description of the modified LPA, we zoom in to each section of this corridor, and there will be graphics that will be able to illustrate each of the design options. It is hard to see some of those on this corridor-wide graphic, but we do have that information in the draft SEIS.
Sounds like more information to come. Thank you, Angela. Next question, and Greg, I'm going to pitch this one to you. It's about funding, and I think you answered a lot of this, but we'll go for it again. In the absence of full secured funding, will it be possible to commence construction?
Yes, we know that some of the federal grant programs, specifically from the Federal Transit Administration, we will not know or receive that full funding agreement for several years. So we will begin the project with the funding we have and live within our budget to move this forward. The longer we wait, the more expensive the project becomes. So we're going to break ground and start getting this thing underway.
Great, thanks, Greg. And I think maybe a little bit related to this, Greg, Chris, Angela, the question is, it's sounding like this project is definitely moving ahead. It's just a question of the details. Is that the case, or is there a scenario where nothing gets built?
So I'll jump in and Angela and Chris can kick me electronically if I go astray. We are on a path to getting this project underway. Now, there's always things that can occur that can sidetrack a project, but we have gone through some of the toughest reviews, and we think that having committed funding is one of the most assured ways of getting this project under construction. So from my standpoint, I think we are well on the way to seeing ground being broken on this project in late 2025.
Anything to add, Angela or Chris?
Sure, I can add that, one critical milestone to advancing the program is completing the phase that we're in with this NEPA document, the supplemental draft EIS, followed by the final and a record of decision. We need to have that record of decision to move forward for advancing the design and right-of-way acquisition, as we mentioned. And so it's one step. And so, yes, there could always be a decision to not build the project, but we are certainly advancing the program with faith that it will be built. There is a need out there. As we learned from the Columbia River crossing, the need does not go away. And in fact, in many cases, it worsens. And so there is a great need for improvements to the bridge.
And I like where you went with that, Angela. I was just going to add to, you said it already, that the technical requirement of NEPA is that you do look at a no action alternative. And so that will be out there. But it's also important to realize that no action does not mean doing nothing, because there will continue to be a need for maintenance on the bridge and safety considerations. And so we're moving as quickly as we can. We're hoping to get to through the NEPA phase and get to that record of decision so we can start moving forward. But we always look at that no action alternative as part of the analysis.
Thank you all. I'm gonna jump ahead in the queue here because there's a question about that shift again. So just gonna zoom back to our map. And is this shift between Mill Plain and SR14 given the
It is.
It is.
It
Okay.
is. It doesn't go as far north as Mill Plain, which is why I mentioned Evergreen Boulevard, which is, if you're familiar with Vancouver, that's an overcrossing of I-5. But yes, that is the general vicinity between Mill Plain and SR14.
Great. Thanks, Angela. Okay, next question. Greg, what delivery method will be employed? Design build, fast tracked, other?
So we are looking at over 28 different contracts to build out this project in its entirety. And we believe that we will be using every delivery method that is currently in use today in the industry. So you will see design build, you will see progressive design build, you will see construction manager, general contractor methods. You will also see design bid build. So we're gonna have a variety of tools in the toolbox that we're gonna bring to bear to help deliver this in the most rational way and in the most efficient way we can.
Great. Thank you, Greg. This is a question for Greg and Angela and Chris again. Specific question is, Greg, you indicated that there will be a way for people to easily find their area of concern within the SEIS. But since this is a supplemental document, since this is a supplemental document, how will people identify what or how this draft is different from the original EIS to see what the changes are?
I will
Greg,
leave that to Angela.
That's an excellent question. What we have tried to do in the draft supplemental EIS is provide a lot of breadcrumbs, if you will, to show, to explain what has changed from the prior EIS that was conducted for CRC and where we are today with the modified LPA. So for example, when we describe what the modified LPA is, what that alternative is, we have some call out boxes that summarize how it differs from what was evaluated previously in the Columbia River Crossing project. And similarly in Chapter 3, that's where the impacts and benefits are analyzed by over 20 different environmental disciplines. Each of those sections has a subsection that talks about changes to air quality or to neighborhoods or to ecosystems, what has changed since 2013 when the last NEPA analysis was conducted for the program. And so we are trying to make it easy so you don't have to go back to the old document and do that comparison. We've tried to incorporate that within the supplemental environmental impact statement so you have one document to reference. However, we will be posting the prior environmental documents and making those available. if you are interested in looking back at the older documents.
Great, thanks, Angela. Next question is about tolling. So the question is, can you speak to tolling? Like, when will it start? What percentage of budget do you expect to come from tolling? And what is being considered?
So I will tackle that. Currently, we have authorizations from both states to toll the interstate bridge. And we have the transportation commissions from each state are looking at setting policy as well as setting rates for tolling the bridge. These tolling funds will be used to help pay for the bridge. Currently, we are looking at what we have put forward to the subcommittee of these two transportation commissions are rates that vary between $1.50 per trip to $3.55 per trip. So they will be looking at that and making a final determination. We're hoping to generate between 1.1 to 1.6 billion in revenue to help pay for this bridge over a 35 to 40 year time period.
Great, thank you, Greg. So I'll just note that we have about 12 minutes remaining in our time, and we have 2 questions in the queue. So if you are interested in getting your question answered, I would recommend that you add it in the next couple of minutes. So we'll go to the next question. If the LPA, if the locally preferred alternative chosen is a fixed span, but the Coast Guard does not agree to the lower bridge height and requires 178 feet, resulting in a movable span, is the project prepared for that? And how would additional funds be sought to build the movable span?
So I'll start this, David, and I'll look for help, of course, from folks if there's more to say. Our environmental document will analyze all of the options for a crossing. So we are going to look at the fixed span. We'll look at a movable span as well. If the LPA is chosen, but that is something that is not permitted, we will have the information within our environmental document to work from that puts us in a position to do an analysis to make sure that we're moving ahead the right way. Along with that, our team is also considering the costs of the different options that are in front of this. So we have an understanding of what the different options would require. And if we were faced with that, then we would start pushing into an area of putting the pieces together to figure out how it is that we move forward. I'm going to stop there because I'm more environmental and not on the funding side, but if there's anything else that folks want to add to that.
So Chris, I'll just add that we are discussing with the current river users, and we've put together a document that looks at future uses of the river and the height that is necessary. So those conversations are ongoing. And I would remind folks that during the Columbia River crossing, we were able to reach agreement and had received a permit for 116 feet fixed span. So we think we can get there again, but it is a continuous conversation with the U.S. Coast Guard and the river users in this section of the Columbia River.
Great, thank you, Chris and Greg. Greg, another tolling question for you. What about tolling of semi-trucks per axle? Can you speak to axle tolling?
And that is a policy question that will be answered by, once again, the subcommittee of the two transportation commissions on Will they toll by truck shape and size, or will they toll by axle? So that is a decision that group will make and inform us of how we will proceed forward.
And Greg, just quick follow-up anticipating. Do you know the timeline for that decision?
So we were hoping by next spring that subcommittee will have completed their work and give us back the information we need to proceed forward with what the tolling policy and the tolling rates will look like.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, next question. Is the scrap metal from the old bridges going to be used to pay for the new bridges?
David, yeah, I can take that one.
Yeah, go for it.
So at present, our Section 106 programmatic agreement does have or will have a component that will consider ways to reuse or recycle those materials. So that will be forthcoming in an analysis to best answer that question and understand all of the options available. Thank you.
Thank you, Haley. Next question is about other facilities. Will the I-205 bridge also be tolled?
So there are no plans for the tolling of the I-205 bridge at this point.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Okay. If the project will still be built, even if there is not enough revenue for the entire project, what would be eliminated from the project? Is there a prioritization already determined for what would be dropped if funding is not enough? If not, how would decisions be made for what does not get built as part of the project?
So, David, I'll tackle that, and others can join in. The first thing that we are required to do on projects of this size and complexity is to do value engineering to make sure that we are building the most efficient project or program that we can. So that will be the first step. Secondly, there are other federal dollars that may become available to us that we will be constantly on the lookout for if we do not have enough to build the project. But once again, if those funds are not immediately available to us, we will live within our budget and we will build to our budget. And we know that the 6 purpose and need statements are critical, that we have to achieve those purpose and need statements. So those are things that we will get accomplished.
Great, thanks, Greg. At this moment, there are no open questions. So I will give it just a minute in case anything pops up. And as we're waiting, Greg, is there any kind of closing remarks you'd like to share?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for participating in this briefing. The questions are outstanding, and we encourage that everyone participates. So the folks who participated, let your family, let your friends know that this is coming, and we need them to weigh in, and you continue to weigh in to help make this project as inclusive and reflective of the community as possible. So thank you, everyone.
Excellent, thanks, Greg. And just as you were wrapping, we got an additional question to come in. And I think we can call this the last one of the evening. It's going back to the Coast Guard again. So the Coast Guard suggested a lift bridge or tunnel to meet 178 feet. If they hold firm, would a tunnel be reevaluated?
So we have looked at the tunnel issue back during the Columbia River Crossing project, and we looked at the tunnel issue again during interstate bridge replacement, the current iteration. And a tunnel creates several problems. And if you go to our website, you will see the discussion of why a tunnel doesn't work. But some of the basic things is that a tunnel would not be able to have a interface with SR14, which is one of the major generators of traffic. A tunnel would not be able to provide a interchange on Hayden Island. So those are key elements. A tunnel also is much more expensive than a bridge, and a tunnel has long-term cost that a bridge doesn't have. You have to have air handling capacity, and for a tunnel of this length, we would be daylighting up near Evergreen Street. And that, once again, would create the ability or the inability to have bicyclists and walkers come and access the waterfront in a reasonable way. So there are a lot of drawbacks to a tunnel. But once again, if we cannot reach agreement on the 116 fixed span that we propose, we do have design options that look at a movable span. So if worse comes to worse and we cannot meet that, we do have options that will meet the purpose and need for the program.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg. So on that note, I think we can call it a night. I want to echo Greg's thanks for the great questions and the participation tonight. And I also want to give a thanks to our American Sign Language interpreters. This has been a very technical meeting, and appreciate your ability to keep up and making this necessary interpretation available. So thank you. Okay, I think we can close it. So thank you, everybody.